Dan Fogelberg stood frozen in the snow-covered parking lot, a cheap paper bag clutched to his chest, the cardboard corners of a six-pack of beer biting into his fingers. He was in his late 40s, his joints starting to ache in a way no stretch or aspirin could quite erase. A few days earlier, in a room that smelled of disinfectant and quiet dread, a doctor had pressed a phrase into his life like a cold stamp. Advanced prostate cancer. The word advanced did most of the damage. It suggested something already in motion, something that had been quietly working while he was busy doing other things. Writing, recording, touring, hiding, pretending time was an abstract concept. Suddenly, time was not a poetic device. It was a chart on a clipboard and a finite number of treatment options. Tonight on Christmas Eve, the pain in his bones was real. A low, persistent throb running along his spine and into his hips. But that wasn't what cut deepest. The thing that slid between his ribs came from behind him, from the wheezing ceiling speaker inside the convenience store he'd just walked out of. "Met my old lover in the grocery store." It was his own voice, younger by 3 decades, untouched by diagnosis, drifting out into the cold. He could hear himself high and clear, narrating another snowy night, another grocery store, another cheap bag of beer. Time folded over on itself, and for a second it felt as if the two men, the one inside the song and the one standing in the parking lot, were watching each other through the glass doors. Inside, the cashier didn't look up. To him, it was just another song in the holiday rotation. A woman in a thick parka by the lottery tickets hummed along without noticing whose name sat under the title on the little digital display. Cars nosed in and out of the lot, tires crunching on old snow. Out here under the sodium glow, Dan stood perfectly still. For most of the world, same Old Lang Syne was a seasonal ghost. A sad Christmas song you either welcomed or reached to turn off when it got too close. For him, it was a page out of his own diary that he had pinned down and duplicated and sent spinning into other people's lives. He had turned a private ache into a public ritual, and now, with cancer quietly chewing its way through his body, the page had fluttered back and smacked him in the face. The question in his head wasn't, "How much time do I have left?" It was, "What exactly have I done with the time I already spent? My life is as an artist, not an entertainer," he had told an interviewer once, the words coming out calm but carrying a small, sharp edge. He'd meant that he cared about the work more than the applause, the process more than the charts. Standing there with a paper bag in his arms and his own younger voice narrating his past from a rusty speaker, he wondered if he'd managed to live up to that sentence, or if he'd simply become the man who wrote music for other people's memories. Snowflakes collected on his shoulders, melted on his skin. His breath hung briefly in front of him and vanished. Behind the glass, his younger self sang about a 6-pack of beer and a car in a parking lot. And for once, the past didn't feel like a thing behind him. It felt like something reaching forward, tapping him on the shoulder, asking him to answer for it, to understand how he arrived at that parking lot. A middle-aged man with a diagnosis in his chest and his own song filling the air behind him. You have to go much further back, to a different kind of light and a different kind of stage. You have to go back to a little boy standing on a wooden box in front of his father's band. He was born Daniel Grayling Fogelberg on August 13th, 1951 in Peoria, Illinois. It was, in many ways, an ordinary Midwestern town. Trains came and went, factories ran, people worked, married, raised families, retired. The sky was big, the seasons honest, the horizon seemingly fixed. Inside the Fogelberg home, there was another horizon entirely. His mother, Margaret, would sit at the piano in the living room, her fingers spilling Chopin, Debussy, and Mahler into the air, shifting the mood of the house with a few measures. For a boy lying on the rug with toy soldiers or schoolbooks, music wasn't just something he heard. It was something that changed the weather of the room. His father, Lawrence, carried music differently. As a high school band director, he spent his days teaching teenagers to read dots on a page and turn them into breath and brass. He was the man at the front of the room, arm raised, baton poised, waiting for a room full of restless kids to fall, miraculously, into one beat. One day, when Dan was 4, the band decided to have some fun. They set a wooden box in front of the stands and lifted him onto it, placing the baton in his small hand. The musicians watched, smiles tugging at the corners of their mouths. "Go on," his father said quietly from behind him where only the players could see. "Give them the downbeat." Dan lifted his arm. The baton felt heavy, serious, like a magic wand he hadn't earned. He brought it down in a clumsy arc. The band came in, trumpets bright, drums firm, saxophones weaving in. They were really following Lawrence's discreet cue, but the boy on the box didn't know that. For him, this was the moment the world responded to his gesture. He would carry that sensation, half real and half stage, for the rest of his life. Move your hand, release your voice, and the air around you changes. Later, in Leader of the Band, he would sing about his father's gentle means of sculpting souls, trying to find the words to express what it meant to grow up in the orbit of a quiet man whose whole job was to shape noise into meaning. Nestled inside that song is a snapshot of the boy on the box, not yet knowing he was learning the blueprint for his own future. The house was full of instruments. There was a piano, then guitars, then whatever he could lay his hands on. A cheap bass, a borrowed flute, an old mandolin someone had traded for a favor. He learned chords, scales, how to put one note next to another until something inside him clicked. His mother taught him to practice until the muscles in his hands remembered what his brain forgot. His father taught him to respect the work, to take the craft seriously even when nobody was looking. The radio added another layer. Out of its small speaker came Elvis's swagger, the Beatles' harmonies, Dylan's riddles, the lonesome cry of country singers, and the intricate poetry of Joni Mitchell. The songs built entire worlds in 3 minutes. They made him feel less alone and more aware of his own loneliness all at once. At school, he wasn't the star athlete or the loud mouth in the back row. He was the kid with the guitar, the one who could make a classroom go weirdly quiet when he played. While other boys measured their worth in points scored or fights won, he measured his in verses finished, choruses that finally sounded right. He played in local bands, of course. It was the late 60s. You assembled your friends, chose a name that sounded important, and dragged your amps wherever anyone would have you. They played high school dances, VFW halls, bars where the smoke hung low and the audience was only half listening. On some nights, when the sound was right and the crowd actually leaned in, he could feel something approaching liftoff. His guitar, his voice, the rumble of bass and drums aligning into a moment that felt bigger than the room. On other nights, the sound was muddy, the crowd indifferent, and he went home with his ears ringing and his confidence dented. He went to the University of Illinois and split his time between classes and coffee houses. In those dim rooms, he stripped it all back down to one man, one guitar, and whatever he could fit into a song. He played to people nursing cheap coffee and quiet heartbreaks, some of them really listening, others using his melodies as background to their own conversations. The seeds of a lifelong tension were being planted. When did music become art, and when did it become wallpaper? Was it his job to entertain the room or to tell the truth and let the room decide what to do with it? The first big leap came when Irving Azoff, a young manager with sharp instincts and an eye on bigger stages, saw him perform and recognized something in him. Not just talent, but a particular combination of vulnerability and discipline. Azoff thought beyond Peoria and campus clubs. He thought about records and radio. With Azoff's help, Dan signed with Columbia Records. His debut, Home Free, came out in 1972. It didn't blow up the charts, but it planted something in the culture. The songs were melodic, introspective, gently produced. People who found it tended to hold on to it. It didn't make him a star, but it moved him from the margins into the map. The real detonation came with Souvenirs in 1974. Suddenly, he was in studios with Joe Walsh, a man whose guitar tone had been the soundtrack to Dan's own teen years, and surrounded by an orbit of musicians like Don Henley, Glenn Frey, Graham Nash, names that belonged in his imagination, on album sleeves, not in his address book. They played on his songs. They treated him like a peer. Recording at Caribou Ranch in Colorado, he woke to frost on the windows and went to sleep under high-altitude stars. Between takes, he would step outside and see nothing but snowfields, pine trees, and the distant line of mountains, the air thin and sharp in his lungs. Inside, the console lights glowed like a different constellation. He was caught between two kinds of elevation, literal and metaphorical. The Souvenirs yielded Part of the Plan, a song that climbed into the Hot 100 and showed programmers that this guy from Illinois could sit comfortably between the big names they were already spinning. The album went double platinum. The soft-spoken singer-songwriter became suddenly a name other people dropped. There are moments in a career when you can feel the click of some invisible lock. One of his came in the middle of America late at night, driving in a beaten car between shows. Fiddling with the radio, he caught the last seconds of someone else's song, then heard, "And next up, here's Dan Fogelberg with Part of the Plan." He pulled over, hands trembling on the steering wheel, and listened to his own work come back at him, no longer as a fragile thing on tape, but as a broadcast signal, bouncing off towers and into houses he would never enter. Headlights passed, snow blew across the asphalt, and for a moment he felt both huge and tiny. A man alone in a car in the dark, his voice everywhere. The floodlights of success swung his way. He toured relentlessly. Stages got bigger, PA systems got taller, hotels got nicer. So did the expectations. Nights on stages where thousands of faces blurred into one organism. An audience that inhaled together, laughed together, cheered together. Spotlights turned his hair into a halo, disorienting in their brightness. On some nights he stood there and felt a rush so pure it was almost religious. The feeling of entire arenas singing his words back to him. Not as fans, but as co-owners. The early 80s crystallized his High Noon. Phoenix gave him Longer, a ballad so romantic that it floated like incense through weddings, anniversaries, and first dances. At shows, he could see couples turn toward each other as he played those opening chords, their hands finding each other in the dark. People proposed under that melody, married under it, years later divorced with it still echoing in their heads like a promise they weren't able to keep. Then came the innocent age, and with it the strange experience of being everywhere and yet feeling slightly out of time. He poured himself into that double album, structuring it like a novel in 4 sides. It was his meditation on childhood, youth, middle age, and the looming edge beyond. In those sessions, he wasn't thinking about radio edits. He was thinking about chapters. Nights blurred into mornings as he obsessed over details. The exact tone of a piano on Same Old Lang Syne, the ache in the strings on Leader of the Band, the swell of harmonies on Run for the Roses. The first time he took those songs out on a major tour, the Thung Hoa was almost overwhelming. In some city, it barely matters which because the moment repeated itself. He walked out into a sold-out arena, the kind with tiers climbing so high that the last row seemed to touch the rafters. The roar that greeted him was a physical thing, a wall of sound that pushed against his chest. Spots from above carved him out of the darkness. His band took their positions. The first notes of the Innocent Age material seeped into the air. Later in the set, he introduced Same Old Lang Syne. A cheer went up just from the title. He told a shorter, more polished version of the story than the one he carried in his gut. A Christmas Eve, a grocery store, an old love. People laughed in the right places, sighed in the right places. Then he started the song. Verse by verse, you could feel sections of the crowd leaning inward. You could see couples who had their own old lover in the grocery store memories tighten their grip on each other's hands. When he sang, "We drank a toast to innocence, we drank a toast to now," the line that had come from a very specific car in a very specific parking lot suddenly belonged to 20,000 people at once. The leader of the band was even more intense. Some nights he would dedicate it to his father, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just in his own mind. As he sang about an older man whose blood runs through my instrument, he would see men his father's age in the crowd wiping their eyes and younger faces looking suddenly stricken, as if realizing for the first time that their own leaders of the band would not be there forever. When he reached the final verse, "I'm just a living legacy to the leader of the band," there were always a few beats of silence before the applause, as if the room needed a moment to remember how to be noisy again. Those were the nights when the past felt Thunghua, shot through with light. It wasn't just the literal beams from overhead, white, blue, amber. It was the sense that everything he had lived up to that point had come together into something that made sense, at least for an hour and a half. Then the house lights came up. Backstage, the contrast was harsh. One minute he was a figure bathed in carefully aimed beams. The next he was a man sitting alone on a folding chair, untying his shoes in a concrete room, listening to the muffled sound of the crew tearing down the show. Half-eaten catering trays, an open road case, a paper set list crumpled in a pocket. The Thunghua evaporated quickly when he closed the dressing room door behind him. The applause fell away like water down a drain. The fluorescent lights hummed. Sometimes he would sit on the edge of the couch, guitar still in his lap, and feel as if the silence in the room was actively pressing against his eardrums. He was grateful, he was exhausted, he was exhilarated, he was lonely. In hotel rooms after concerts, television light flickered over his face as he channel surfed past late-night comedians and music videos, sometimes catching a glimpse of himself in a clip from earlier years, sometimes seeing newer acts storming the same charts he'd once helped rule. There was no scandal in his life, no overdose, no spectacular public meltdown. The drama was quieter. A man trying to reconcile the way the world saw him. Soft rock star, king of tender ballads, with the way he saw himself. A serious craftsman, a guitarist who cared about tone as much as tears. A writer who wanted his songs to hold up on a page even without the music. Soft rock as a label became both a crown and a cage. On the radio it meant airplay. In certain magazines it meant derision. He read reviews that dismissed him as schmaltzy, as the sonic equivalent of wallpaper. He knew from the letters he received that his music was anything but background to the people who listened. But it is hard, in the long empty hours between shows, not to let the sneers sink in. Instead of chasing their approval, he went looking for something he trusted more. He moved fully into the Colorado ranch, letting the tours grow fewer and the industry swirl around him rather than through him. The spotlight he'd stood under so often was exchanged for the harder, cleaner light of high-altitude mornings, the kind that makes every line in the mountains and in your face stand out. On sunny afternoons he would walk the property, dogs ranging ahead, snow melting into mud under his boots in the spring, crunching clean underfoot in winter. On clear nights the stars were viciously bright, indifferent to platinum plaques and chart positions. He found comfort in the rituals of ordinary work. Fixing a fence that had sagged under snow, checking on horses in a blowing storm, carrying bales of hay, feeling his muscles complain in a way that had nothing to do with critics or managers. Inside his studio on the ranch, the light was more controlled. Lamps, not spotlights. A console instead of a crowd. This was the kind of illumination he trusted. The small circle of bulbs over a mixing desk. The glow of VU meters as tape rolled. He recorded high country snows, leaning into his love of bluegrass, surrounding himself with players who cared less about image and more about the sound of fingers on strings. He cut albums with Tim Weisberg that felt like private conversations more than public pronouncements. The label still released his records, but the gap between his commercial peak and his current work grew. In the 1990s, when he did tour, the venues were different. The arenas gave way increasingly to theaters, festivals, intimate halls. The fans aged with him. You could see gray in their hair now, not just his. Couples who had danced to Longer at their wedding turned up with adult children. People who had played leader of the band at their father's funerals came to say thank you with their presence. From the stage, he could feel the difference between the light of ascent and the light of enduring. In the early shows, the applause had been laced with excitement for what was still to come. In the later ones, it was filled with gratitude for what had already been. The roar was softer, but in some ways deeper. Sometimes after those shows, instead of going straight back to the hotel, he would linger at the edge of the stage, signing CDs, programs, old vinyl sleeves that people had carried carefully through rain and snow. Men his age would grip his hand and say, "Your song got me through when my dad died." Women would tell him they met their husbands because of a Dan Fogelberg concert. Someone would always mention Christmas, grocery stores, saxophones. The older he got, the more his Thung Hoa moments were tied less to charts and more to these flickers of recognition in someone's eyes. And yet, even as his songs deepened their hold on individual lives, the wider culture's attention moved on. New styles rose. New tragedies occupied the public's limited empathy. The term soft rock became a punchline in some circles. Articles about the history of rock hardly mentioned him. When he died, some television networks didn't even run a chyron. The Lang Syne came not only from illness, but from a particular kind of forgetting. The cancer diagnosis in 2004 slammed reality down on top of all his abstractions about time. It took the themes he'd explored in his work, aging, regret, the painful beauty of looking back, and made them physical, inescapable. Days acquired a new rhythm. Appointments, treatments, rest, side effects. He learned the language of oncology the way he'd once learned the language of chord charts. Numbers meant something. PSA levels, blood counts, months between scans. On good days, he could almost fold it into his existing philosophy. Now is the only thing that exists. He would sit on the porch in Colorado or on the weathered steps in Maine, watching light move across a field or water and feel briefly. Like nothing beyond that moment mattered. On bad days, the future pressed against his ribs. Not the future in terms of tours or records, but the future in terms of his wife sitting alone in the house, the dogs aging without him, songs sitting unreleased on tapes in a drawer. At night in Maine, Eggemogan Reach was a strip of ink. During the day, it flashed silver. He had written The Reach years earlier, turning this very stretch of water into a metaphor for longing and distance. Now he watched actual waves move across its surface and knew that sooner than he'd once thought, his body would be scattered there. He wrote and recorded when he could. The studio became both refuge and reminder. In that room, with headphones on, voice in his ears, he could forget the hospital smell and the taste of metal in his mouth. Outside that room, pill bottles lined up on a shelf like a new kind of discography. On some afternoons, the mail would bring thick envelopes from fans who had heard about his illness. Gene would open them, stack them on the table. He would sit with a cup of tea gone cold and read letter after letter. People telling him about how same Old Lang Syne had kept them company in lonely apartments. How leader of the band had been played at a father's funeral in a town he'd never heard of. How Run for the Roses had been the soundtrack to a child leaving home. Some wrote that they had gone for a medical checkup because of his public letter about cancer. That doctors had caught something early. That his warning had literally saved their lives. He had been worried in some dark corner of his mind that he had lived as background music. Here, in shaky handwriting and printed emails, was proof that, in the dim rooms of other people's lives, his songs had been the only light sometimes. He knew no critic would ever write about this part. Legacy in the public sense would always be measured in awards, rankings, think pieces. But late at night, when pain kept him awake and the sea outside was a black sheet, he would remember particular sentences from those letters, and the shadow would lift enough for him to breathe. He kept recording as long as he could stand at a microphone. Some sessions for what would become Love in Time were slow affairs. He would sing 2 takes and then have to sit down, waiting for the room to stop spinning. Other days, something like the old Thung Hoa returned. His fingers found their way around a guitar neck with ease. His voice, older, rougher, but still his, climbed into melodies and settled there, the tape running silently as a witness. He knew these might be the last songs. He knew he wouldn't be able to tour them, to present them under hot lights to cheering crowds. These songs would live a quieter life, maybe. They would arrive after he'd left the stage for good. He recorded them anyway. He showed June where the recordings were. He talked her through his wishes. "If I'm not here," he said, "make sure they're not just sitting on a shelf." It wasn't vanity. It was completion. He had always treated his songs as chapters in a book he was writing about himself and by extension about everyone who ever felt like him. He didn't want the last chapters to be trapped in his own 4 walls. When he died in 2007, the world did not stop. No stadiums went dark. No emergency news bulletins interrupted programming. The sea outside his window kept moving. Somewhere, someone probably listened to Same Old Lang Syne that day without knowing the man who sang it had just left the world. Jean carried out his wishes. Love in Time appeared 2 years later, his voice reaching across the gap, sounding unnervingly like it always had. For listeners who had aged alongside him, it was a shock and a comfort to hear that same timbre, that same mix of gentleness and gravity return from beyond the point where they'd expected it to end. In the years since, his legacy has lived in 2 very different kinds of light. There's the bright, official light. Inductions, reissues, retrospective articles that call him a defining soft rock voice. Box sets that gather his work into chronological order. There are campaigns to get him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Arguments online about influence and metrics, fans making the case that his songwriting deserves the same institutional nod given to louder, flashier contemporaries. Then there is the softer, more important light, the way his songs keep showing up when people need them. A man in his 50s, his own hair going gray, drives home from the hospice where his father has just died. The radio plays Leader of the Band. He pulls over because he can't see through the blur in his eyes. A woman in her 30s, recently divorced, pushes a cart through a supermarket on December 24th, trying to buy last-minute ingredients and not think about the life she thought she'd be living. Same Old Lang Syne comes on overhead. She stops by the dairy case, one hand on a carton of cream, suddenly remembering someone from a decade ago and feeling a complicated, familiar ache. A young musician born after Longer left the charts, finds The Innocent Age in a used record bin, buys it for the cover art, and sits in a small apartment listening to a stranger articulate feelings about time and loss that they haven't yet found their own words for. None of those moments will make headlines, but they are the real places where his work lives. The Thung Hoa, the soaring, ecstatic moments of his past, happened under hot stage lights, in the glare of cameras, in the studio control rooms where songs took shape, surrounded by people with names destined for history books. The sad, narrowing corridors of his later years were lit by table lamps in quiet houses, by the glow of medical monitors, by the small, stubborn flame of his need to write, even when his body was tired of carrying him to the desk. Between those extremes, he walked a long strip of twilight, a life where the light and dark were constantly trading places. He was Thung Hoa when he stood at center stage in 1982, guitar slung across his shoulder, hearing the first notes of Same Old Lang Syne trigger a collective intake of breath in an arena full of people. He was Thung Hoa when his father, sitting in an audience somewhere in Illinois, heard leader of the band live, and knew, maybe for the first time, exactly how his son saw him. He was in the shadow years later when he stood alone in a half-empty hotel bar after a show, watching a younger act on the big screen play to a stadium, feeling both proud to have paved some of the road and quietly aware that he would never be that young again. He was in the shadow in fluorescent waiting rooms, signing forms with trembling hands. He was in the shadow when he walked slowly back up the hill to his house in Maine, the wind colder than he remembered, his breath coming shorter. But even in those shadows there was light. The lamp on the piano, the LED on the recorder, the open notebook on the table. The knowledge that as long as he could get the next line down, the dark couldn't quite have everything. So when you think of Dan Fogelberg, you can picture any of the versions of him you like. The boy on the wooden box, arm raised, believing the band is really following him. The young man in the Laurel Canyon studios trading stories and harmonies with Joe Walsh and Don Henley, half amazed to be there and half too focused on getting the guitar tone right to fully feel it. The radio king, hair feathered, voice everywhere, filling the airwaves with ballads people pretended to be too cool for and secretly leaned on. The mountain rancher in Colorado, flannel shirt, dogs at his heels, snow up to his boots, the sky enormous and careless above him. The man in Maine staring at a stretch of water he had already turned into a song, wondering how many more he had left in him. The middle-aged figure in the snowy parking lot holding a paper bag, listening to his own voice drift out of a store and feeling for one long moment the full weight of having lived long enough to be haunted by himself. A quiet boy on a wooden box once lifted a baton and felt, however mistakenly, that he could make a whole room move by raising his hand. Decades later, the songs he wrote moved through lives he never saw. If someone like that can take the thin light of their own private moments, the awkward grocery store encounter, the tenderness toward a father, the fear of a diagnosis, the serenity of a mountain morning, and turn them into a glow bright enough to guide strangers through their darkest hours, then what does that say about the unrecorded stories the rest of us are carrying? And when our own bodies start to falter, when our advanced moments arrive in whatever form they will we look back and see only a blur of days that left no mark? Or will there be, somewhere in the world, some small melody or honest line or fragile thing we made that keeps playing on after we're gone? Proof that we didn't live our lives as mere background noise, but dared, at least once, to step into the light and say, "This is how it feels to be me, in this time, in this snow," and trust that someone somewhere might need to hear it.